I smoothed the front of my blouse, pearls resting steady at my collarbone, as the shutter snapped again and again, each flash capturing my family without me. "Just us," my daughter-in-law said, her smile polished sharp as glass. "Just us." After 71 years of giving, I was cropped out of the picture. But what they didn't know was that I still held the frame that mattered most, the fortune. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Marjorie had dressed carefully, the way one does when told they'll be remembered in photographs. A soft blue blouse pressed crisp, a silver necklace resting just beneath her collarbone, and her favorite pearl studs, small but elegant. When she walked into the studio lobby, smelling faintly of roses and starch, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had been in front of a camera most of her life. But the look Danny gave her was not admiration, it was evaluation. "Oh," Danny said, lips tightening into something polite but thin. She flicked her manicured hand toward the dressing area, where racks of matching cream sweaters and khaki trousers hung. "We're just starting with the nuclear family first. You can sit for a bit." The word nuclear landed sharper than it should have, as though Marjorie had shown up to the wrong play altogether. She turned toward her son, hoping for reassurance, but Alec only tugged at his cufflinks and kept his eyes on the floor. His silence said enough. Ruby, perched on a stool while the photographer adjusted lighting, caught her grandmother's gaze. "Grandma, we can do one together after this. Just us," she said, hopeful. Danny's tone was swift, smooth, dismissive. "Maybe later, honey. Let's not get off schedule." So Marjorie sat. The studio couch was a cream leather that squeaked faintly when she shifted. From there she watched the careful choreography. Danny adjusting Ruby's hair strand by strand. Alec being moved half an inch left. Danny checking the shots on the photographer's tablet before he could even suggest changes. The flash went off in rhythmic bursts. Snap, snap, snap. Each one a tiny explosion that seemed to erase Marjorie a little further. She had spent decades behind cameras, waiting patiently for unguarded moments that revealed truth. This scene had none of that. It was curated, manicured, sealed tight like a glossy magazine cover. The sound of Ruby's laughter was the only thing that softened the edges. But even then, Marjorie noticed how Danny would step in, readjust Ruby's collar, demand the smile be more natural, as if joy could be staged. Minutes turned to nearly an hour. The air smelled faintly of hot bulbs and Danny's perfume, sharp and citrusy. Marjorie folded her hands in her lap, pearls cool against her skin. She waited for the moment they would wave her in, the gesture that would say, "You belong too." It never came. The last shutter click sounded, followed by Danny's satisfied exhale. "Perfect," she announced, kissing Alec on the cheek like a woman who had just closed a business deal. "Exactly what I envisioned." The photographer began packing his gear. Ruby lingered near her grandmother's side, but Danny caught her wrist. "Come on, sweetheart. We don't want to keep him longer than we paid for." Marjorie rose slowly, smoothing her blouse. "Did you want one of me with Ruby?" she asked, soft but steady, leaving the question open like an olive branch. Danny's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Next time, maybe. Today was about us." The walk back to her car felt longer than it should have. Boulder's mountain air was crisp, the sun glowing low against the glass of the photo studio, yet she felt an odd chill beneath her blouse. She had been erased without anyone saying the words aloud. At home that evening, she brewed chamomile tea and sat near the wide living room window. The silence of her house, once filled with Alec's teenage music, Ruby's childhood chatter, seemed more profound than usual. On the wall above the fireplace hung a framed black and white photo she'd taken years ago. Alec at 10, holding a trout by a Colorado creek, his grin wild and genuine. She touched the frame lightly, wondering if memory would always feel more permanent than the present. The following morning, her phone buzzed. She slipped on her glasses and opened the notification. There it was, Danny's latest post. The family photo glowed with studio perfection. Alec in a tailored sweater, Danny luminous in cream silk. Ruby poised between them with a smile that looked carefully rehearsed. The caption read in a flourish of curated intimacy, "Just us." That was Marjorie's first thought as she scrolled through Danny's post, the glow of the phone screen casting pale light across her breakfast table. There they were again, gleaming like a page torn from a lifestyle magazine. Alec in muted gray, Danny draped like she'd been styled by a designer. Ruby posed between them with her smile trimmed into neat symmetry. But beneath the polished perfection, something felt hollow. It was the caption that delivered the blow. Just us. Not even a crumb of acknowledgement. No mention of Grandma. No affectionate nod. Not even in the long chain of hashtags Danny had littered beneath. Family goals, heart's blessed life, Frasexy our tribe. The omission was louder than any insult. Her coffee had gone lukewarm in the ceramic mug, bitter on her tongue as she sipped absently. The comment section bloomed with affirmations. Gorgeous family, picture perfect. Such a vibe. Danny, you nailed it. Each one was like a door shutting. And then she saw Danny's reply to a neighbor's comment, asking if Marjorie had joined them. Yes, just our little tribe. The word tribe landed like a slap. Danny had always chased labels, rebranded ordinary life into something curated and consumable. But this wasn't branding, this was erasure. The house around her was silent, only the faint tick of the wall clock cutting through. She set the phone down, pressed her fingertips to her temples, and drew a slow breath, trying to unclench the knot in her chest. Outside, the Colorado light poured across the foothills, but she felt dimmed, like a lamp with its cord quietly yanked from the wall. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't social media. It was Gretchen, sending a blunt text. Saw the photo. They're curating their lives without you in it. Marjorie stared at the words, then let out a thin laugh, dry and humorless. Gretchen never sugar-coated, but sometimes clarity stung more than cruelty. She typed back a simple, "I know." Another buzz. Alec this time. Sorry about yesterday. It was chaotic. Chaotic? That was the excuse. Not deliberate exclusion, not Danny's controlling hand, but chaotic. She pictured him sitting in his sleek office, thumbs moving over his phone as if an apology could be outsourced like one of his consulting memos. She didn't respond. The coffee table in front of her held a stack of newspapers, unopened mail, and, beneath it all, a leather folder she hadn't touched in years. She drew it out slowly, brushing a faint film of dust from the cover. The sound of the clasp snapping open was startling in the stillness. Inside, her handwriting looked unfamiliar to her now. Neat, deliberate, hopeful. The last time she'd signed her name to these pages, she'd still believed in family as an unbreakable frame. Alec and Danny's names were printed there, bold on the lines designating heirs. Ruby's too, tucked safely in the form of a trust meant for her education. Her thumb lingered on Alec's name. Once upon a time, she had imagined him standing at her side, carrying forward not just possessions but memory, story, legacy. Now she could barely picture him looking her in the eye without Danny's permission. She closed the folder but didn't return it to the pile. Instead, she slid it to the center of the table and laid it flat, staring at it as if the paper itself might answer the questions clawing at her chest. A decision was forming, quiet but steady, like a storm gathering at the edge of the mountains. She had been cropped out of a photo, erased with the click of a caption. But what Alec and Danny didn't realize, what they couldn't imagine, was that she still held the pen to the frame that truly mattered, and this time she would decide who belonged in it. The leather folder lay open on the dining table, its pages breathing the stale scent of paper that hadn't been touched since 2018. The ink was still sharp, the signatures precise, but to Marjorie's eyes the words looked brittle, like a promise that had already rotted. Alec and Danny's names stared back at her in bold black print, co-heirs to her estate. Ruby's was there too, softened by the protective shell of a trust for her education. Marjorie traced her fingertips slowly down the page, pausing at Alec's name. Her chest tightened, not from nostalgia, but from recognition of how far he had drifted. He had once been her little boy in muddy sneakers, trailing trout water through the kitchen, begging her to teach him how to hold the camera steady. Now his silence echoed louder than Danny's directives. The phone rang. Gretchen's voice came through, dry as always. "So? You're really going to let them waltz away with curtain calls after they shoved you into the wings?" Marjorie let the pause linger before answering. "It's what I set down years ago. I thought fairness would hold." "Fairness is for stages, Marge, not for thieves." Gretchen exhaled sharply, like the crack of a gavel. "You still want to give them that kind of stage time?" Marjorie closed the folder with a firm press. The soft thud on the table was louder than it should have been. "No," she said quietly, "not anymore." Her fingers hesitated only a second before dialing Harper Meeks's office. The estate attorney's assistant answered with brisk professionalism, and within minutes, a consultation was on the calendar. When she hung up, the house seemed to inhale with her, like even its beams understood a shift had been made. She fetched a notepad from the kitchen drawer and began a list in neat, deliberate handwriting. At the top she wrote, "What they think they're getting." Beneath it, house, savings, artwork, IRA, legacy. Then a hard line across the page. On the other side she wrote, "What they will actually get." For now, that column remained blank, but not for long. The thought steadied her. For once, she wasn't reacting to Danny's curated world. She was creating her own narrative. Later that evening, while watering her orchids, she saw a new post from Danny floating across her feed. A sweeping shot of the Mountain View patio, the house glowing in twilight. The caption, "Someday, this place will be ours. Can't wait to make it our own." The casual audacity of the statement made Marjorie laugh. Not a laugh of humor, but of disbelief sharpened into steel. Her home, where every frame on the wall had a story, every scuff on the hardwood a memory, reduced to Danny's placeholder dream. Danny wasn't waiting for someday. She was already rehearsing ownership. When Gretchen stopped by with a bottle of Pinot later that week, she found Marjorie sitting at the dining table again, papers spread across like a war map. "You're digging trenches," Gretchen said, peering over her shoulder. "Not trenches," Marjorie corrected, eyes narrowing. "Boundaries." The two women clinked glasses, and for the first time in days, Marjorie's smile didn't feel forced. The next morning, her phone lit up with an email from Harper. At first it was routine, the kind of pre-meeting diligence attorneys performed before drawing new documents. But halfway down, Marjorie froze. Harper had attached a scanned record from the county clerk's office. It was a deed transfer, an early one, listing partial interest in her house. Signed and filed, but not by her hand. The signature at the bottom was hers, an uncanny imitation of her looping letters, but she had never touched that page. Marjorie stared at the screen, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and fury. The quitclaim deed Harper had sent glowed coldly in the afternoon light spilling through her window. At the bottom of the page, in looping black ink, sat her own name, or what was supposed to be her name. The signature was wrong. Not sloppy, not childlike, but too precise, like a photocopy pasted onto the page. It had none of the small hesitations her hand carried now, none of the lived-in imperfections of age. Someone had traced her identity as if it were a stencil. Her phone rang, the sharp trill snapping her out of her trance. Harper's voice was steady, professional, but clipped with controlled anger. This was filed at the county clerk's office 3 months ago. It lists a partial interest in the property, transferring from you to Alec Kent. Did you sign this? No. Marjorie's voice was low, sharp, almost unrecognizable to her own ears. I most certainly did not. There was a pause on Harper's end. then we need to act quickly. This isn't an inheritance strategy, it's fraud. Marjorie's pulse quickened. Fraud. The word filled her ears like a drumbeat. For years she had told herself Donnie's hunger for appearances was shallow, irritating at worst. But this was more than image. This was intrusion. By the time Gretchen arrived that evening, Marjorie had printed the document and laid it flat on the table between them. Gretchen leaned over, adjusting her glasses. She read the lines silently, then looked up, her jaw set. "That's not inheritance," she said, tapping the false signature with a firm nail. "That's identity theft." The word struck Marjorie like a hammer. Identity theft. They hadn't just left her out of a photo, they had tried to write her out of her own home. "I've already locked the title records," Marjorie said, her voice steadier now. "Harper filed the fraud alert. No further changes can be made without my notarized consent." "Good," Gretchen replied, settling into a chair. "Now the question is, how far do you want to go?" Later, when Alec finally called, his voice was coated in the kind of smooth calm he used in corporate boardrooms. "Mom, you have to understand, it wasn't malicious. It was just for tax purposes. Danny thought it might simplify things down the line." "Tax purposes." Marjorie repeated the words like a stone rolling in her mouth. She glanced at the orchids on her windowsill, the way their pale petals leaned into the evening sun. She said nothing. "Look," Alec tried again, his voice tightening. "No one's trying to take anything from you. We wanted to be prepared. That's all." Marjorie remained silent. The longer the silence stretched, the more Alec filled it with fumbling explanations, each one thinner than the last. She let him talk until he finally gave up, muttering that they'd figure it out later. When she ended the call, her hands did not shake. They were steady as she gathered the old will from the dining table, the one she had dusted off just days before. The folder felt heavier now, not because of the paper inside, but because of what it represented. A trust placed in people who had already begun chiseling her away. She carried it to her desk, sat down beneath the lamp, and opened a blank document on her computer. The cursor blinked like a pulse on the screen, waiting. For years, she had believed her legacy was safe in ink and law, that family ties were stronger than signatures. But signatures could be forged, love could be staged, loyalty could be captioned out of existence. Not anymore. Marjorie adjusted her glasses, laid the old will beside her, and began drafting a new one, line by deliberate line, her resolve hardening with every keystroke. The cursor blinked at her from the screen like a metronome, daring her to make the first move. Marjorie's hand hovered over the keyboard, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened glass of the window beside her. Outside, Boulder's late autumn sky glowed with the bruised purple of evening. The world looked ready to close in, but Marjorie's mind was sharp, focused, unyielding. She began typing, not tentatively, not with hesitation, but with the steady hands of someone who had lived long enough to know what permanence meant. The new draft of her will was not a correction. It was a rewrite. Line by line, she dismantled the assumptions Alec and Danny had built their lives upon. Their names, once positioned prominently as co-heirs, disappeared with the press of a key. Where they had expected wealth, property, and art, there would be nothing, no crumbs, no consolation prizes. In their place, Ruby's name remained, but not untouched. Marjorie paused, considering her granddaughter carefully. She loved the girl deeply, but she also knew how corrosive Donnie's influence could be. Ruby deserved freedom, not another gilded cage, so she wrote a condition. The trust would unlock only if Ruby completed 2 years of volunteer work, community service that touched lives beyond curated perfection. Marjorie pictured her working at a women's shelter, an art program, maybe a clinic. She wanted Ruby to see the world in all its raw edges, not just through Danny's polished lens. Satisfied, she continued. The house, her sanctuary, her gallery of memories, would no longer be dangled as a prize. It would not become Danny's showroom or Alec's trophy. Instead, she placed it into a foundation dedicated to women in the arts. She pictured students walking barefoot across the creaking hardwood floors, carrying canvases streaked with paint, pausing at the windows to drink in the mountain view. The house would breathe with purpose long after she was gone. Every brushstroke of her plan carried intention. Harper's steady guidance filled the margins of the document, her voice sharp and unwavering over the phone. We'll include an ironclad no contest clause. If Alec or Danny tries to challenge this, they'll forfeit whatever scraps they think they can claw from it. Marjorie's lips curved slightly. Perfect. And irrevocable protections, Harper added. Once this is signed, notarized, and filed, it won't be subject to anyone's tampering. Marjorie leaned back, listening to the scratch of her pen as she signed the preliminary draft. The sound felt like steel locking into place. Later, Gretchen joined her at the dining table. The wine glasses sat half full, ignored. Gretchen flipped through the new draft, her dry chuckle slicing through the quiet. Poetic justice with a paper trail. If Shakespeare were alive, he'd be jealous. Marjorie smirked, but her eyes glistened. They wrote me out of a photo, Gretchen. I'm writing them out of my future. And giving Ruby something stronger than money, Gretchen replied, tapping the conditional trust clause. You're giving her roots and wings. The room smelled faintly of lavender from the candle burning on the windowsill, mingling with the faint metallic tang of ink and paper. For the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel empty. It felt fortified. When Harper arrived the following morning, briefcase in hand, the revisions became official. The documents were notarized, sealed, and stacked neatly in a folder. Every page was a barrier against Danny's ambition. Every line a rebuke to Alec's passivity. As Harper packed up, she looked Marjorie in the eye. It's done. You've reframed the narrative. They won't see it coming. Marjorie nodded, her pearls cool against her collarbone as she straightened. That's the point. But even as the ink dried, Marjorie's thoughts reached further. They had tried to control her story through a single photograph, curated and broadcast as if she were already erased. Now she wanted a different image, one that told the truth of who she was, who mattered, and who didn't. That evening, as the sun dropped low behind the mountains, she picked up her phone and dialed a number. Her voice, calm but certain, filled the quiet room. Yes, I'd like to schedule a portrait session. The morning of the shoot carried a crisp brightness, the kind that made Boulder's mountains look sharper against the sky. Marjorie opened the front windows, letting in cool air that smelled faintly of pine. The living room had been rearranged, chairs moved back, rugs rolled away, walls cleared for light. This wasn't going to be Danny's studio polish spread. This would be something different, something alive. When the photographer arrived, Marjorie welcomed him with the ease of someone who had spent decades in photojournalism. No posing, she instructed gently. Capture what's here, as it happens. Nothing staged. Soon Ruby appeared, her sneakers squeaking against the hardwood. She carried a sketch pad tucked under her arm, her smile unguarded this time. Gretchen followed close behind, rolling her eyes as she set down a tote bag. Never thought I'd be a model at my age, she muttered. The art students trickled in, 3 young women from Marjorie's old workshop. They brought energy, laughter, the faint smell of acrylic paint lingering on their clothes. The room began to hum with warmth, conversation overlapping, hands gesturing, Ruby sketching on the floor as Gretchen teased one of the students about their paint-splattered shoes. The photographer moved quietly around them, catching Ruby's spontaneous giggle, Gretchen's dramatic scowl when teased back, Marjorie leaning in with her pearls glinting as she listened. No stiff collars, no manufactured smiles, just people connected by something real. Marjorie felt her chest loosen as the shutter clicked, not the suffocating rhythm of Danny's perfect tableau, but the honest staccato of life unfolding. By the end of the day, one photo stood out. Ruby sat cross-legged on the rug, sketchpad in hand, Gretchen mid-laugh with her head thrown back, the students leaning together as though they belonged to the same family, and Marjorie seated among them, her hand resting lightly on Ruby's shoulder. A matriarch? Yes, but not in the way Danny defined it. Here, she wasn't excluded. She was centered. A week later, the framed print hung in the entryway where Danny's studio portrait once commanded the wall. The difference was stark: life against performance, truth against fiction. When Danny arrived unannounced on a Saturday, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood, she stopped the moment she saw it. Her expression didn't change instantly. It curdled slowly, like milk left too long in the sun. Her smile froze, eyes narrowing just a touch before she forced brightness back into her tone. "Well," Danny said, shrugging out of her coat, "that's interesting." Marjorie didn't flinch. "Tea?" she asked, her voice calm, almost sweet. Danny hesitated, then nodded stiffly, settling onto the couch like a guest rather than an heir. Alec arrived minutes later, shoulders hunched from the cold, his glance flicking from the photo to Danny and back again. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Neutral, as always. He busied himself with his phone, pretending not to notice the air shifting between the two women. Marjorie poured the tea slowly, the porcelain clinking softly against saucers. She carried the tray in steady hands, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. No explanations, no defense. The picture spoke for itself. Danny sipped without comment, but her jaw was tight, her eyes fixed too long on the steam rising from her cup. Alec avoided Marjorie's gaze entirely. Ruby, sensing the unspoken storm, excused herself to the kitchen under the pretense of getting sugar, though everyone knew she was seeking space to breathe. The conversation never found footing. Danny's usual chatter fell flat. Alec's murmurs filled only the silence, and Marjorie kept her smile serene, as though she hadn't noticed Danny's discomfort at all. When they finally left, the house felt lighter. Marjorie stood beneath the new portrait for a moment, staring up at the captured laughter, the softness of Ruby's gaze, Gretchen's sharp grin. It wasn't just a picture, it was a declaration. Her phone rang. She picked it up, expecting Gretchen. Instead, it was her accountant's voice, tight with concern. "Marjorie," he said carefully, "I thought you should know. Alec attempted to access your IRA account this week." The silence that followed was heavy as stone. The news hit harder than Marjorie expected. Her accountant's voice, normally measured and unshakable, carried a subtle edge of alarm. Alec had attempted to access her IRA, using credentials from a power of attorney that should have expired years ago. The image was grotesque in its intimacy. Her own son, not asking, not calling, but slipping through old keys to see if any doors still opened. Marjorie sat at her desk, the faint smell of lavender polish rising from the wood, and opened the email Harper forwarded from the bank. The request was clumsy, a grasp at something Alec thought would be easy to slip through unnoticed. But nothing about it felt careless. It felt deliberate. She picked up the phone. Harper answered on the second ring. "I've already contacted their legal team," Harper said, calm but firm. "Your account is locked. All outdated permissions are revoked. They won't get a penny or a line of information without your consent." Marjorie nodded, though Harper couldn't see it. "Thank you." The silence afterward was heavier than she wanted to admit. She had expected exclusion, mockery, even falsification. But this was an attempt to measure her worth in numbers, to tally her future like an inventory sheet. She reached for a pen. The sound of it scratching against paper was deliberate, each stroke measured. At the top of the page, she wrote a single line: "I am not confused. I am just done." When Gretchen dropped by later, she read the line aloud, then raised an eyebrow, sharp as glass. She set the page down carefully. "He's building a case for your incompetence, Marge. Little whispers, subtle paper trails. If Danny's got her claws in this, they'll try to paint you as fragile, scattered, easy to override." Marjorie folded her arms, the pearls at her ears cool against her skin. "Then we'll flip the script." "Exactly." Gretchen leaned back in her chair, her grin dry as a matchstick. You schedule a cognitive evaluation. Voluntary. You walk in, prove you're sharper than a room full of consultants, and walk out with a notarized report. They can't spin that. The suggestion lodged itself in Marjorie's chest, firm and unshakable. She had spent decades proving herself through photographs, through truth captured on film. Now she would prove herself again, this time not through art, but through paper that no one could falsify. That evening, she called Harper and scheduled the evaluation. The appointment set, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction, sitting by the window as the foothills faded into shadow. Her resolve was no longer an ember. It was a flame. But as she settled in with tea, her phone buzzed again. Danny's name lit up the screen with a new post. The photo was smug, polished, and staged. Alec and Danny, side by side, Ruby standing between them. The caption burned like acid. Our turn to lead. The clinic smelled faintly of lemon polish and coffee grounds, a sterile warmth that tried to disguise the fact that people came here to prove themselves. Marjorie sat in the waiting room with her hands folded neatly over her leather bag. She wore the same pearl studs she had chosen for Danny's photo shoot weeks before, but this time they weren't an ornament. They were armor. When the therapist emerged, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a clipboard, Marjorie rose. Without hesitation, her steps were steady, her back straight, her expression calm. She wasn't here to defend herself. She was here to make a record. Inside the evaluation room, the questions came one after another. Dates, word recall, shapes to memorize, then redraw. Puzzles to solve aloud. Marjorie's fingers gripped the pencil with practiced ease as she sketched a clock face, hands pointing to 10 after 11, her lines clean and sure. The therapist smiled. Most people hesitate on that one. Marjorie's lips curved faintly. I've spent a lifetime noticing details others overlook. The test stretched over hours. Short-term memory drills, logic sequences, planning exercises. At one point, she was asked to interpret a scenario about budgeting for household expenses. She not only explained the solution, but outlined 3 alternative approaches. The therapist's pen scratched notes furiously, her eyebrows rising higher with each answer. By the time the session ended, Marjorie felt neither drained nor rattled. She felt sharpened, like a blade honed on a whetstone. 2 days later, Harper arrived with a sealed envelope. She broke the seal in Marjorie's presence, sliding the document across the table. The words jumped out at her in bold clinical clarity: cognitive functioning, intact, comprehension, strong, planning ability, exceptional. The therapist had added her own line at the conclusion. Mrs. Kent demonstrates clarity of mind beyond expectations for her age. She exhibits no signs of diminished capacity. The report was signed, notarized, and tucked directly into the estate file, a permanent shield against whispers, and the whispers were already stirring. That same week, Danny posted a vague status online. She's not herself lately. Prayers appreciated. The comments flooded in. Sympathy, gentle concern, speculation disguised as kindness. Danny responded with sad-faced emojis, her performance flawless. When Gretchen saw it, she nearly spit her coffee. They're building rumors, she said, slamming her mug down with a sharp clink. We're building records, and records win in courtrooms, not hashtags. Marjorie only nodded, her calm unbroken. She had no need to battle Donnie in the theater of appearances. She was scripting a different play entirely, one that would outlast social media's fleeting memory. That weekend, Ruby came for lunch, the kitchen filled with the smell of rosemary chicken and butter rolls, the kind of meal Marjorie always made when she wanted comfort to slip in unnoticed. Ruby poked at her plate at first, quieter than usual, her eyes flicking toward her grandmother with worry. "Grandma," she said finally, voice barely above a whisper, "are you okay? They've been saying things." Marjorie set down her fork and reached across the table, covering Ruby's hand with her own. The skin beneath her palm was young, smooth, unlined, the opposite of her own. "I'm better than okay," she said softly. "And someday you'll understand how important that is." Ruby studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if trying to tuck the reassurance away like a secret. After dessert, Marjorie excused herself and returned with a small sealed envelope. She placed it in Ruby's hands, her gaze steady. "Open this when it matters most," she instructed, her voice low but firm. "Not before. Promise me." Ruby's fingers tightened around it. "I promise." The pen slid across the page with a finality that felt almost ceremonial. Marjorie signed her name to the trust documents, her handwriting steady, each letter deliberate. Outside Harper's office window, snow flurries dusted the flat irons, their sharp ridges softened under white. Inside, however, everything felt sharper, colder, irreversible. "This is fully binding," Harper said, her tone measured but firm. She stacked the documents, slid them into a leather-bound folder, and looked directly at Marjorie. "No amendments can be made without your explicit authorization, and once you're gone, not even a court can unravel it." Marjorie allowed herself a slow breath, the air dry against her throat. "That's exactly what I want." The trust was more than protection, it was architecture. Alec and Danny had been erased completely, not just from inheritance, but from any residual scraps they might twist into a claim. Their names were gone, their expectations severed. The house, instead of landing in their grasping hands, was committed to a foundation, a retreat center for women in the arts. Marjorie pictured students carrying sketchbooks through the halls, hearing their laughter echo in the stairwell, paint stains on the wood floors where Danny would have demanded polished perfection. Life instead of display. Her art collection, decades of photographs, carefully framed and stored, was shielded as well. Harper had written ironclad language. The pieces were protected from resale, safeguarded for exhibitions tied to the foundation. Donnie would never auction them off to stage a living room in beige. At Gretchen's suggestion, a governance structure was added. Marjorie named Gretchen co-director of the foundation, ensuring the retreat would be overseen by someone with a gavel-strong sense of fairness and a refusal to bend to pressure. Gretchen's dry grin when she read the clause was satisfaction enough. And Ruby, Marjorie's heart tightened there. Her granddaughter's trust remained conditional. 2 years of volunteer work, 1 internship in a therapeutic or service-based program, not to punish her, but to shield her, to ensure she built a spine of her own, not one shaped by Danny's curated expectations. When Ruby earned it, the trust would be hers. Money, security, independence. A path to a life unshackled. Harper slid the last document across the desk, her tone low but certain. "With this structure, they have no avenue. The no contest clause is ironclad. If Alec or Danny challenge it, they receive nothing, not even a symbolic $1. Marjorie picked up her pen again, the weight solid in her hand. She signed. The sound was steady, final, like a door closing behind her. When it was done, Gretchen leaned back in her chair and exhaled. "They thought you were drifting, Marge, but you just built a fortress with paper walls they can't climb." Marjorie allowed a small smile. "Let them keep staging their pictures. I've staged the future." The office smelled faintly of ink, leather, and the faint trace of Harper's peppermint tea. Outside, the snow thickened, muting the city noise until everything felt sealed in glass. Marjorie stood, fastening her coat, her pearls glinting in the fluorescent light. For the first time in months, she felt untouchable. But untouchable wasn't the same as unchallenged. 2 mornings later, as she sipped her coffee in the stillness of her living room, her phone lit up with an email forwarded from Harper's assistant. It was a petition, filed formally in court. Danny Kent, requesting appointment as conservator over Marjorie Kent, on grounds of diminished capacity. Marjorie's hand did not tremble, but the cup rattled faintly against its saucer. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper, the kind of space where truth felt stripped of warmth, reduced to exhibits and signatures. Marjorie sat upright at the respondent's table, pearls at her ears catching the light, posture so steady it made her look carved from stone. Harper sat beside her, flipping neatly tabbed binders, each section marked in bold red. Across the aisle, Danny was rigid in her seat, hair swept into a polished knot, lips pressed into a smile that didn't touch her eyes. Alec lingered half a step behind her, shoulders stiff, gaze fixed anywhere but on his mother. Case number 19-142, the clerk intoned. Petition for conservatorship of Marjorie Kent. Danny rose first, smoothing the skirt of her cream dress. Your Honor, my mother-in-law has shown patterns of forgetfulness and erratic decision-making. We're simply concerned for her welfare. This is about care, not conflict. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with silver hair pulled tight, leaned forward. Do you have supporting evidence? Danny faltered for a breath, then gestured vaguely. Family accounts, observations. It was Harper's turn. She stood, calm but cutting. We anticipated this. From her binder, she produced the notarized cognitive evaluation, conducted last month voluntarily by a licensed clinician. Results: near-perfect scores, planning, comprehension, and memory intact, not a trace of diminished capacity. The judge flipped through the document, her lips twitching. Sharper than half my docket, she muttered, audible enough to draw muffled chuckles from the gallery. Harper didn't stop there. She slid another folder across the table. Here are the estate logs, financial safeguards, and records of Mrs. Kent's direct actions in recent weeks. Independent, precise, and properly executed. Then she gestured toward Marjorie. And of course, Mrs. Kent is here to speak for herself. Marjorie rose slowly, the weight of the room pressing on her shoulders, yet her voice carried steady as she addressed the bench. Your Honor, I am 71 years old. My memory is not failing. My judgment is not impaired. What is impaired is my family's respect. This petition isn't about care, it's about control. Her words hung in the room like a lens snapping into focus. Danny's smile thinned to nothing. Alec shifted uncomfortably, his thumb tapping against his leg, as if itching for a screen to disappear into. The judge glanced between the parties, expression flat but decisive. Petition denied, rejected with prejudice. The gavel cracked down once, sharp and final. Danny's face blanched, then flushed crimson. She opened her mouth to protest, but Harper was already stacking her papers with surgical precision. The case was over. In the corridor outside, Alec attempted damage control. He lingered near his mother, voice hushed, eyes darting away. Mom, this wasn't about control. You know that, right? We were just worried. Marjorie turned her gaze on him, steady, unblinking. You mean it wasn't about your control? Her words cut quieter than a shout, but deeper than a blade. Alec flinched, his lips parting as if to respond, but no answer came. Danny stormed past without a word, heels clicking hard against the marble. The faint scent of her citrus perfume lingered like smoke. Harper touched Marjorie's arm lightly. You handled yourself flawlessly. But Marjorie wasn't listening to the praise. She knew the fight had shifted. The courtroom was just one theater. Danny and Alec would find another stage. Later that week, the first strike landed quietly. Marjorie received notice from Ruby's school office. At Ruby's own request, Danny had been removed from the emergency contact list. Ruby's words landed with more weight than Marjorie expected. They were sitting on the back porch in the soft glow of late afternoon, mugs of cocoa steaming in their hands, the flat iron streaked pink in the distance. Ruby traced the rim of her mug with a nervous finger before finally whispering, "They made me feel like you didn't matter." The ache that bloomed in Marjorie's chest was sharp, like glass pressing inward. She placed her hand gently over Ruby's, warm and steady. You'll never have to believe that, sweetheart. Not from them, not from anyone. Ruby looked up, her eyes glistening. Promise? I promise, Marjorie said, her voice carrying a strength that steadied them both. 2 days later, Danny arrived uninvited at Ruby's school function, an awards assembly in the gym, the smell of polished floors and popcorn from the concession stand clinging to the air. She walked in wearing a tailored blazer and that unshakable smile, waving to other parents as though she owned the place. But the secretary intercepted her before she could step inside the auditorium. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Kent," the woman said firmly. "Your name isn't on the student's contact list anymore." For the first time, Danny's smile faltered. "There must be some mistake." "It's not," the secretary replied, unflinching. "School records were updated last week. You'll need to speak with Ruby's guardian about changes." The gym door shut firmly in Danny's face. Inside, Ruby accepted her award with flushed cheeks and a wide smile, scanning the crowd until she found her grandmother's steady wave. That evening, Marjorie sat at her desk surrounded by neatly stacked forms. School contact sheets, medical authorization slips, guardianship addendums. Each page was signed, notarized, sealed. She had replaced Danny's name with her own wherever the law allowed. Alex, too, when possible. When Gretchen arrived, she brought a new addition for Harper to file, an amendment to the trust. "Clause for Ruby," Gretchen said, setting the papers on the table. Protection against coercion or forced pressure from her parents. If they try to manipulate her into signing anything, inheritance, power of attorney, even a loan, the trust shields her. Marjorie's eyes softened. "Thank you." "It's more than paper, Marge," Gretchen replied. "It's armor." Later, Danny's fury found its outlet online. A single post appeared on her feed, dripping with vague venom. "You reap what you sow." The comments filled with sympathetic clucks and emojis, friends rushing to praise her resilience without knowing what she was truly lamenting. Marjorie saw it, allowed herself a small smile, and whispered aloud to the empty room. Exactly. Because she wasn't sowing vengeance, she was sowing permanence. Every document filed, every boundary enforced, every clause added was seed in the soil of a legacy that would bloom long after Danny's hashtags vanished. Days later, the phone rang. This time, it wasn't Harper or Gretchen or even Alec. It was a local reporter. The young woman's voice trembled slightly with excitement as she explained that news of Marjorie's planned donation had reached the paper. The house's future as an arts foundation had piqued the community's interest. "We'd like to feature it," the reporter said. "Front page." Marjorie listened, her eyes drifting to the portrait in her entryway, the one of Ruby laughing, Gretchen mid-scowl, art students leaning in as though bound by invisible thread. The photo radiated something Danny's studio spread never could. Truth. She agreed to the interview. By the weekend, the Boulder Daily carried her story under a bold headline. "Local Woman Leaves Creative Legacy, Foundation to Empower Young Artists." The article detailed her plans for the house, the trust, the art collection. Neighbors stopped by with congratulations, letters poured in from former students, and the phone rang with messages of gratitude. But the most powerful reaction came not from strangers, but from within her family. Danny's silence stretched for days. No posts, no hashtags. Then, at last, a new headline appeared. Not on her social feed, but in Marjorie's hands. The paper that morning carried her face, her name, her legacy. Danny had tried to crop her out. Now the whole town was looking right at her. The morning paper lay on Marjorie's porch, its edges still damp from the sprinklers. She bent to pick it up, her joints stiff in the cool air, and there it was splashed across the front page. "Local Woman Leaves Creative Legacy, Family Surprised." Her photograph, taken during the recent interview, filled nearly half the cover. She wore her soft blue blouse, pearls glinting, the flat irons blurred behind her. Her lips curled into a smile as she read the opening line. At 71, retired photojournalist Marjorie Kent is ensuring her story will outlast her family's erasure. By mid-morning, her phone buzzed nonstop. Former students wrote long emails thanking her for believing in them years ago when no one else had. Young artists she had never met sent messages filled with awe. One letter, written in careful cursive from a high school sophomore, said simply, "You showed me there is a future for girls who love art more than math class." Marjorie pressed the letter to her chest. The paper warmed from her hand. Meanwhile, across town, Danny and Alec faced the story's fallout. Their neighbors leaned over fences with curious smiles. "Did you see the article?" one woman asked Danny, voice bright with too much interest. Another asked Alec, "So, when's the retreat center opening?" "Big surprise, huh?" Danny's smile was brittle, cracking at the edges. "We're still processing," she said, her words clipped. Alec muttered vague agreements, his tie loosened more than usual. Neither of them had expected to be sidelined in the paper, just as Marjorie had sidelined them in her will. By evening, the story had spread beyond Boulder. Elder rights groups shared it online, praising Marjorie as an example of reclaiming autonomy in the face of manipulation. Comments filled her feed. "You're an inspiration, protecting your legacy your way. Bravo." Proof that age doesn't mean surrender. Gretchen arrived with a bottle of Chardonnay and plopped it on the counter. "Well, Marge," she said with a dry grin. "They posted captions, but you made headlines. And now the whole damn country knows what you did." Marjorie poured them each a glass. "I didn't set out to be a headline." "No," Gretchen said, lifting her glass. "But the right ones write themselves." The two women clinked glasses, the sound bright against the hum of the refrigerator. That night, with the paper still open on her coffee table, Marjorie drafted one last amendment. She pulled out the estate folder, pen steady, and added a new clause: zero contact. Upon her passing, no direct communication or involvement from Alec or Danny would be permitted with the Foundation, Ruby's Trust, or any related entity. The wall she built around her legacy was now absolute. She signed, the scratch of the pen a final boundary they could never cross. The next morning, however, her body betrayed her. Rising from bed, she felt a heaviness in her chest, not sharp but insistent. The air in her room smelled faintly of dust, and for the first time in months, she reached for the headboard to steady herself. She moved slower through the day, her breath thinner, her steps careful. The mountain view outside her window seemed more distant than usual, blurred by a veil she couldn't quite shake. Marjorie pressed her hand lightly against her sternum, telling herself it was fatigue, nothing more, yet a quiet awareness whispered at the edges of her mind. Time was narrowing, even as her legacy expanded. The heaviness in Marjorie's chest didn't ease in the following days. Her steps were slower, her breath thinner, but her mind, sharp as ever, moved with an urgency that her body could no longer match. She knew she had one task left, one frame to complete before she faded from the edges of her family's story. At her desk, the lamp pooled warm light across a clean sheet of paper. She drew in a steadying breath, the faint smell of ink and cedar wood grounding her, and began to write. The first letter was for Ruby. She chose her words carefully, each sentence stitched with tenderness. "My dearest Ruby," it began. "By now you've seen the portrait in the entryway, the one where you are laughing, Gretchen is teasing, and I am smiling at you. That is the family I want you to remember. One made not by blood or control, but by choice and joy. You will hear whispers, you will feel pressures, but know this, your worth was never a reflection of how others framed you. It is in what you choose to build. The trust will open to you when you have given part of yourself to others. Do it not for the money, but for the strength it will give you. My greatest hope is that you will grow into a woman who can never be cropped out of her own life." She sealed it with trembling hands, her lips pressing against the envelope like a benediction of love. The second letter was shorter, colder. "For Alec, you stood beside silence while I faded from view. No more, no less." She folded it neatly, sealing the envelope with a press of her palm. She left space in her heart for the son she had raised, but none for the man who had looked away when she was erased. The third letter stretched longer than the rest, written with precision for the Public Trust Archive. Here, she laid out her vision with the clarity of a manifesto. This house will be more than walls and beams. It will be a place where young artists find their voices, where women stand at the center of their own frames, unedited and unashamed. The gallery will hold my photographs not as artifacts, but as proof that truth cannot be staged. The education fund will ensure that no girl has to choose between survival and creation. This is my legacy, not what was cropped away, but what was chosen with purpose. By the time she finished, her hand ached, but her spirit felt lighter, as though she had transferred the last of her weight onto the page. The next day, Harper and Gretchen came by. Together, they reviewed the documents, letters, and amendments, their voices low and serious in the quiet house. Harper slid each into a heavy safe, the metal door closing with a resonant thud. Gretchen rested her hand on Marjorie's shoulder afterward. "It's all there, Marge. They can't touch a word of it." Marjorie only nodded, her smile faint but resolute. That evening, Ruby found her grandmother in the living room, seated near the fire. Marjorie handed her the sealed envelope with her name on it. Ruby tore it open carefully, reading line by line, her breath catching halfway through. By the time she reached the end, tears streamed silently down her cheeks. She folded the letter back into its envelope and hugged her grandmother tightly, clinging to her as though the embrace itself might freeze time. "Thank you," Ruby whispered, "for seeing me." Marjorie pressed her cheek to her granddaughter's hair, inhaling the faint scent of shampoo and youth. "It was always you, Ruby," she said softly. "Always you." That night, as the first snowfall of the season drifted down, silencing the streets in a hush of white, Marjorie lay beneath her quilt. The cold pressed against the windows, the fire long since dimmed. Her breath slowed, evened out, and then simply stopped. Peacefully, quietly, she slipped out of the frame. The first battle over Marjorie's farewell began before her body was even laid to rest. Alec and Danny rushed to arrange what they called a private family ceremony. They booked a downtown chapel, selected expensive lilies, and drafted a program where Danny's name appeared 3 times. Organizer, speaker, family representative. But Harper was waiting. As executor, she carried Marjorie's signed instructions in a sealed envelope. The ink was still crisp, the directives unmistakable. "The ceremony will be held in my garden. No speeches from Alec or Danny, no media. My story will be told in my own way." When Harper presented the papers to the funeral director, Danny's face blanched, then hardened. "This is absurd," she hissed. "We are her family." "No," Harper corrected, voice as steady as a gavel. "You are her relatives. There's a difference." And with that, Marjorie's plan unfolded exactly as she had intended. On the morning of the funeral, her garden bloomed beneath a fragile winter sun. Volunteers from the art community strung simple white ribbons between bare branches. Folding chairs lined the stone path, their legs sinking slightly into the frosted grass. Guests arrived in quiet clusters, the air carrying the faint mingling scents of pine, coffee, and fresh-cut roses laid along the garden wall. At the front, beneath the arbor she had once covered in climbing roses, stood a framed portrait. Her chosen image from the personal shoot, Marjorie seated among her art students, Ruby laughing at her side, Gretchen caught mid-smirk. The photo radiated life, joy, truth, nothing curated, nothing staged. Ruby approached the lectern with trembling hands, a single sheet of paper clutched tightly, the silence of the garden pressed in as she began to read. "My grandmother taught me that the most powerful photographs are the ones that capture truth. Not perfection, not poses, but truth. Today we aren't saying goodbye to her. We're carrying her truth forward." Her voice cracked, but she steadied herself, the words spilling with both grief and pride. When she finished, the applause was gentle, respectful, the kind that came not from formality, but from shared recognition. Alec and Danny sat stiffly in the second row, hands clasped so tightly their knuckles whitened. Neither was called forward, neither was invited to speak. They remained silent while Gretchen rose instead, her short remarks laced with humor and affection that made the crowd laugh through their tears. As the ceremony ended, volunteers passed out sealed envelopes to each guest. Inside was a copy of Marjorie's Art Foundation mission statement. This house will be a sanctuary for artists, for truth, for women who refuse to be cropped out of their own lives. Guests read in hushed reverence, the sound of paper rustling like leaves in the wind. One woman pressed her envelope to her chest. Another whispered. She thought of everything. Danny's jaw tightened. Alec's eyes flicked away, shame shadowing his face. By the time the last chair was folded and the last ribbon untied, it was clear. Marjorie's farewell had belonged to her, not to them. Her plan had silenced their performance. But silence wasn't surrender. 3 days later, Harper's office received notice. Alec and Danny had filed an appeal, demanding reconsideration of Marjorie's estate documents. They claimed undue influence, coercion, a misrepresentation of her wishes. The ink on her death certificate was barely dry, yet the war they had lost in life, they were determined to drag into court. The court dismissed their appeal without so much as a hearing. A single-page order, signed and stamped, declared Alec and Danny's claims baseless. Petition denied. The words were stark, impersonal, but to Gretchen and Harper, reading them aloud in Harper's office, they felt like thunder. Done, Harper said, sliding the order into the file. They don't get another stage. Gretchen smirked, the corner of her mouth twitching upward. The show's over, curtain down. And outside of court, Marjorie's legacy began to live exactly as she'd planned. Within months, her Mountain View home transformed. Contractors repaired the sagging fence, artists painted murals across the garden wall, and students hung string lights in the arbor where her portrait had stood at the funeral. The smell of turpentine, wood shavings, and fresh coffee filled the once quiet house. Laughter replaced silence. The foundation opened its doors as the Marjorie Kent Retreat for Women in the Arts. Applications flooded in. Writers, painters, musicians, each one seeking sanctuary to create. What had once been a house Danny claimed as her future trophy now breathed with voices Marjorie had chosen. Ruby was among the first to step into that world, not as heir, but as participant. She signed up to volunteer at a women's shelter downtown, scrubbing dishes in the kitchen, listening to stories far different from the curated perfection her mother preached. On weekends, she helped children with art projects, coaxing crayon flowers and stick figures out of hands that trembled with hesitation. Each hour ticked against the trust clock, unlocking her future piece by piece. But Ruby didn't work for money. She worked with a light in her eyes that even Gretchen noticed. "Your grandmother would be proud," she told her one afternoon, handing her a fresh stack of paints. Meanwhile, Gretchen stepped into her role as co-director, overseeing the gallery. She curated Marjorie's photographs with the precision of a judge handing down rulings, portraits of coal miners' wives, protest marches in the snow, a child holding a kite against the backdrop of a Colorado sky. Each image was hung with reverence, lit in soft pools that made the walls feel alive. Visitors drifted through, whispering at the sharpness of her eye, the courage of her framing. On one wall, Gretchen installed Marjorie's chosen quote in bold lettering, "Photos fade, legacies last." And in a quiet corner of the gallery hung one final piece that made guests pause, tilt their heads, and smile knowingly. It was the infamous Just Us portrait. Alec, Danny, and Ruby arranged in their studio perfect tableau. But this version was altered. A skilled digital artist had restored Marjorie's figure into the frame, seated calmly on the edge, pearls glinting, smile serene. Beneath it, a brass plaque read, "The photo they posted." The truth she corrected. Word of the retreat spread far beyond Boulder. National newspapers covered the opening. Art magazines ran features on the unique trust structure, and advocacy groups pointed to Marjorie's plan as a blueprint for elder independence. While Danny's social media accounts grew quieter, the retreat's online presence flourished, filled with candid snapshots of artists painting in the garden, reading poetry beneath string lights, and cooking meals together in the kitchen that once held Marjorie's orchids. Alec and Danny drove by once, late at night, headlights sweeping across the retreat's front gates. The house glowed warm with activity inside. They didn't go in. They couldn't. The locks, legal and literal, were no longer theirs to touch. Ruby, however, went often. She found herself seated in the living room where her grandmother once poured tea, now a common room where artists gathered to share drafts and sketches. Sometimes she'd glance at the portrait on the wall, the one where her grandmother had been digitally restored, and whisper quietly, "You're still here." And in every way that mattered, she was. The retreat thrived, the gallery grew, and Ruby's trust hours piled higher until the future her grandmother had envisioned was fully hers. Gretchen, ever dry, ever blunt, summed it up one evening as they locked up after an exhibition. She tapped the brass plaque beneath "Just Us" and said, "This was never about a photo. It was about who got to keep the frame." The wind outside rustled the trees, carrying the faint smell of pine through the open door. Inside, the retreat hummed with life. Marjorie had been erased once, but never again. They ignored me in the family photo, so I cropped them out of the fortune.